Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Can you hear me? Please raise your hand if at any point you can't. This is rather essential. I have a quiet voice. I'm going to talk, as Madam President kindly said, about the National Heritage List for England. It's known familiarly as the list, but it is, of course, much more than that. It's an incredible resource. It assembles the most significant man-made structures, gardens and historic sites in England. I can say too that I have colleagues with me here tonight, so there are plenty of people who can answer questions should you have at the end, and also one or two people who've been involved in the listing process from an early day who could also fill you in rather better than I can. We can start with some numbers. Ooh, what's done that? Jump down. Just under 400,000 basically. We're nearly there. We hope to hit the figure this year. We'll probably now be within the 12-month period. Not that it's a numbers game, and that's important to stress. And of course, with the population of the country at approaching 66.3 million, the 400k is really just a very, very, very tiny and valuable drop in a very large ocean. So when people complain about protection, I think we should remember how very few things actually are. You'll be familiar with the range of the lists, going back obviously prehistoric times, right through to under 30 years old and one or two younger than that. Much has been done to examine the origins of protection, much research available. One of the best known books, perhaps looking at the 18th century, is Rosemary Sweet's The Antiquaries, the Discovery of the Past in 18th century Britain. And Rosemary, as an antiquarian in Scotland, or working with Scotland, delivered the Rhind lectures with the first on just this subject last year. And they're available online if you're interested. The first state protection, of course, came with the Ancient Monuments Act in 1882. This established a schedule of 50 prehistoric monuments, and thereafter led to a series of conservation battles, really, which followed on, aware from the issues that were brought forward. It also promoted the idea of conservation and a duty in respect of our ancient buildings, and led to Gerard Baldwin Brown's publication of 1905, The Care of Ancient Monuments. We can remember, usefully, that conservation has always been at the start of designation and the protection of our heritage. The case of Tattershall Castle in 1910 you will probably all know well, when it was purchased by an American who attempted to export its architectural contents, but it was stopped by the actions of Lord Curzon of Kedleston. And I think it's interesting looking back now that it took a laird of the lands to intervene, whereas now we would probably expect Save to step in, such as they did with Wentworth Woodhouse. The various other amendments to the 1882 Act in 1900 and 1930 also allowed the inclusion of later monuments and introduced greater levels of protection, as well as criteria, and, very importantly, a system of fines to prevent damage. The relationship with planning has been important throughout as well, and obviously the public health initiatives of the 19th century led to town planning, a system that has developed from there. And there's various legislation has gained pace up to the Second World War to address this. And texts such as The Octopus by Clough Williams-Ellis and the activities of bodies like the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England have gone a long way to inform and to promote the idea of protection. The planless scramble is a wonderful term used by Clough Williams-Ellis. All of this led to the mother of the Planning Acts, as it's called, that we're celebrating this year, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. A very important act because it established listing of buildings of special architectural or historic interest. That's the key phrase. And it also introduced the planning system as we know it today. That is described as planning to secure a proper balance between the competing demands for land so that all the land of the country is used in the best interests of the whole people. So very definitely the mother of the Planning Acts. And interestingly, very aspirationally, the minister who proposed the Act, Mr. Silkin, advised that the Act was to begin a new era in the life of this country, an era in which human happiness, beauty and culture will play a greater part in its social and economic life than they have ever done before. Wonderfully noble. So we have to ask you today if you think he achieved that. I think he went a long way. Here is the team of the 1947 Act, really, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government staff who began the identification of buildings possessing the special interest required. Some of you may know who those are. We have a sheet that tells you. If you're interested, just let me know and I can get you a copy. What strikes us too is there were a healthy mix of women, SBAB members and architects. They used as the basis of this first list the heroic wartime lists, which were known as the salvage lists, created to identify whether a particular building should be protected from bomb damage. And it was around this time too that specific grading was introduced and criteria, which hadn't been there obviously for the bomb damage lists. It took nearly 25 years to complete this first list, resulted in 120,000 entries, quite a significant survey, and has been known as the modern doomsday as a result of that. The first 14 listings were in Great Yarmouth in March 1947. There is no one building, I'm often asked, which was the first listing. I can't say there was. There were 14 all on one day in Great Yarmouth. And the entries in the first year, surprisingly I think, were not country houses, as people have often said. They were in fact medieval churches, barns, and pre-1750 buildings, such as this, which is Wyatt's Almshouses in Godalming. The information in these first list entries was quite basic. It was not there to tell you about the significance or the special interest. It was only to identify the building. The investigators didn't have cameras. They were working only to be sure that something married the address that they were giving. I've actually got a copy of the first investigators' guidance notes for Scotland, but they were borrowed from England, so if you'd like a look at that at the end, you're welcome. These 1948. And the difference, of course, between what the 1947 Act brought to what the 1882 Act had empowered was that listing enabled inhabited buildings to be protected. This is the difference. It also allowed for change to occur, provided that change was managed carefully and the character should survive. So it's a big leap, really, the 1947 Act. And critically too, the lists have continued to evolve from 47, ever developing, ever responding to changing demands and expectations. And I hope to show that as we move on. The next watershed came in 1968 in response to the intensive urban redevelopment of the 1960s and brought into being listed building consent. In a sense, this gave the 1947 Act teeth, powers to actually address the change as it happened. The Ministry of Housing and Local Government, then in charge, set about another survey, a new survey, called the Resurvey, helpfully. And at first this focused on 39 historic cities and town centres, which were particularly threatened by post-war redevelopment. Though consequently it moved into the more rural areas, again with these very brief list entries. The lists were published in spiral-bound volumes from December 1970, and we've got one of these with their green covers known as greenbacks on the screen, and on the right is one of the first entries on the first list of December 1970, the Opera House in Buxton by Frank Matcham. The last ever greenback was for the City of Westminster and was published in 1987. Okay, so who knows who? We think quite a few of you will know people here. In fact, you may even be in the room. We have tried to establish exactly who everybody is. This is the staff of 1972 on the roof of Savile Row. And we would be grateful if you can identify anyone. I've got a more detailed photograph here for afterwards. And if you'd like me to send around the details, we can perhaps establish more accurately who everybody is. We have, if I can use the cursor here, at the top here, this lady, Carol Ryan, who joined in 1968, will next year have been with Historic England, or its previous named bodies, for 50 years, and she's still working on the lists. So you can prove that the work is enjoyable. In August 1980, Michael Heseltine, the Secretary of State for the Environment, took action to accelerate the resurvey. It was moving a bit too slowly, and unfortunately, buildings like this on the left, the Art Deco Firestone factory in 1928 in Brentford, had been demolished, and he was feeling the sense that we needed to pick up the pace. So the accelerated resurvey, which he initiated, was first managed by 22 different local authorities, but then worked with the private sector, notably with 11 architectural practices. And if you work with the lists, you can still see the hand of the different practices reading through. The character is still there. The second survey, as we can call this, the resurvey, also took a more inclusive approach to what could be protected. It looked at a wider range of structures for listing, and it also introduced the 30-year rule. This was to enable the inclusion of more modern designs and building types. Threats to buildings such as that on the right, Bracken House by Sir Albert Richardson, built in 1955, but in 1987 threatened with demolition, introduced the 30-year rule, so that buildings that were under 30 years old, that were facing threat, could be included, but also put a marker that those which were post-war could be included on the list. So this was quite a new step. A fresh review of the urban areas began in 1989 and led to what we call the bluebacks, such as this on the screen, the last of which was completed in Bath in 2010, in fact, by Roger. The next big change really came in 2011, when, although the Heritage Protection Reform Act bill of 2008 had not passed Parliament, various of the initiatives that were conceived at that point were brought about, one of which was the creation of the National Heritage List for England as we know it today as an online database of all designation types. So it includes too the parks and gardens, the battlefields, the wrecks, and the schedulings. And this is it on the screen, a very accessible, searchable, and ever-improving database, and I do encourage you to go to it. Also, when English Heritage, as Historic England then was, took the responsibility for listing from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in 2005, we also further improved the format of the list's entries, including the history, more detail, and bullet-pointed reasons for designation, which helpfully sets out what the significance of the subject is. So here's a very helpful chart from my colleague in Swindon, and it shows basically the dates of the lists, and you can see the spike in the middle there, which is the accelerated resurvey by Heseltine. And it's still going on, of course, but at a much slower rate. So after this introductory romp, where are we now? What legislation do we work to? We work largely through the scheduling to the 1979 Ancient Monuments Act and for listing to the 1990 Town and Country Planning Act. All of this provides a very important tool for the planning system. We work closely with our planning colleagues. But it also celebrates a very rich history. And it enables us to handle the best for future generations. It's something we must be proud of, and I think we don't celebrate enough. We took a survey through Mori and found that 87% of the public support funding to preserve heritage. That's encouraging. We're happy we exist. and that 85% find the historic environment important in the regeneration of our towns and cities. So there's a lot to be said for what we're doing. A critical point too is that Historic England doesn't list, we actually recommend to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. In fact, it's now the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and also sport if you're fans of W1A. So it's important, we recommend, we don't technically list. We work to principles of selection, which are written by DCMS, but which we can help inform, both for scheduling and for listing, and they're both being revised as we speak. Here's a note of the grades of listing too, and the percentages. This is again for the listing of historic buildings. Grade 1, very selective, exceptional interest, and a small percentage. 2-star, more than special interest, and 2, just of special interest. So the vast majority, 92%, are at grade 2, and therefore the consent on those buildings is looked after by the local authority, not by Historic England. The change is managed by local authorities, and that's an important factor in the landscape. The principles of selection are underpinned by selection guides, which help to translate the criteria and apply them across different building types. These are available online, and they make a very enjoyable read, and they help you to understand what we might protect. There are 20 for listed buildings, 18 for scheduled monuments, 4 for parks and gardens, 2 for marine, and 1 for battlefields. And these 2 are being revised at the moment, but really just gently tweaked. As Madam President said at the beginning, I'm very keen to really draw out better the benefits of our historic environment, and with that, the benefits of designation. And Historic England is happily working on this too. We produce each year something called Heritage Counts, which you may know, and that's informed by studies ongoing throughout the year. It's not just about money, it's not just about pound signs, it's much more sophisticated than that. Grant eligibility, you'll understand, obviously if designated, there's an eligibility. Top category only, very likely. Property values, there's arguments here, but generally a listed building is worth more. And there are hidden returns. We did a survey recently that showed that commercial businesses were found to, in listed buildings, found to produce a higher GVA than all of the rest across the UK. This is the heritage premium, and that's something that we need to talk about rather more. I'm very keen on the green agenda. Sorry, it's coming off the slide, off the screen there. But the green agenda is something very important, I think. We adapt existing buildings, and as such, we lower carbon emissions, and we do something in respect of diminishing resources. There's a lot to be said, although people may complain about us looking after that yet another Georgian row of houses. But there are good arguments. There's also a strong case that the historic environment, and therefore designated property, contributes to well-being, sense of identity, place, words we're getting used to hearing. But also breathable buildings. The chief medical officer in Scotland was complaining that asthma was a time bomb about to explode, and the argument being that too many people live in modern, hermetically sealed environments. So breathable buildings are worth a lot. Recent developments. Again, as I say, the lists continue to evolve, and we continue to attend what is expected of them and what the demands are. I've mentioned that we now set out the reasons for designation decision. That's very helpful because it gives you a quick digest from the reams before that of why we've selected this for listing or not for listing. Can go either way. In 2013, following on from the failed 2008 Heritage Protection Bill, prompted by the Penfold Review of 2011, came the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act of 2013. This brought the ability to exclude out-of-character additions and outbuildings, and is particularly a friend of developers. it's interesting. We'd always said that something was of lesser interest, perhaps, so it's not a necessary tool, but it's there, and it's enjoyed by many. It particularly underpins the enhanced advisory services for people who are wanting greater clarity on the extent of listing and what it means to every bit of their building. But these services are paid for, but it's only cost recovery. We're not making a profit. And they enable owners to get revised list entries, fast-track listings through the system, or to assess sites for sensitivity before developers wish to perhaps develop. We can catch those buildings we don't want them to remove. I'm going to come back to enriching the list because this is something terribly important and something I hope you will all engage with if you don't already. But this is a very important initiative which has opened up the public ability to take some ownership of the list, to involve in the histories that we're telling, and include your own narrative and explain why you think they're important. Add images that you've taken too, perhaps showing change. So, helpfully, I can give you just a quick introduction to some of the work that we do through the strategic programs and the reactive casework. The work divides largely 50-50 between strategic work and reactive work. One of these strategic projects we had in 2007, responded to the abolition bicentenary of slavery, bicentenary of the abolition of slavery, which led to a number of new listings, but mainly amendments to existing listings to explain the association. So here you have SS Chulung's very fine Buxton Memorial in London, built in 1865. He was an ardent supporter of the abolition of slavery. And the arch on the right was built in 1834 for Henry Wyatt, who particularly supported the abolition again and was very active in that field. It isn't all easy. Robin Hood Gardens, some of you may know this. Alison and Peter Smithson, 1968 to 72, which I think it was as long ago as 2008, was rejected for listing. But we met a barrage of campaign in favour of protecting Robin Hood Gardens because it was a machine for living, a very modern system, and well regarded. And the Smithsons are well regarded, though some have said they're probably better theorists than they are architects. We found that basically the gardens had been altered too much, and you can see the dates on the photographs that's showing above and below what had happened. We also found that the space within was very narrow, and in fact that to live in, this wasn't a particularly pleasant environment. We found that it didn't reach the very high bar that we necessarily set for listing. Meanwhile, a recent listing, these very fine studios in London, Pembroke Studios, a group of 12 artist studios, all of one same design with North Light, listed at grade 2, built by C.F. Kearley. And David Hockney, not least, had a studio here. A large number of very important names have worked in these studios. I hope that comes out okay. This, again, another rather recent listing, scheduling, I should say, but on the list. This is the Bullfoot Kiwi, which we rather love, a chalk figure in Wiltshire by the Salisbury Plain above the Sling Camp, and it was carved into the chalk by New Zealand troops who were waiting to be demobilised following the First World War. We believe that listed buildings, at any rate, not schedulings, I would hasten to add, can move on and should move on, and they can adapt, and that the happiest, the best listed building is a happy one, and that means a living one. So a lot of change is allowed, and often it's very controversial. This may seem a strange question to ask you all, but it's very enlightening. We've asked it in training groups. It's incredible who uses the list when you think about it. Who they don't even know they're using the list all too often. They will hit on something on Google because they've searched on it. It's a lot more than that. We're working with the fire services at the moment, for example, because they're trying to identify thatched property and from the list. So it's incredible. It's very wide. But very particularly, of course, I hope that you use the lists. And one way, if you don't know about this already, I'm a great fan of it. We don't have a particular app that you can use on your iPhone, but you can use the search by list through the map search, for searching for the listings, and it will come up for you with a picture of where you're standing, telling you with the blue triangles all the listed buildings around you, and all the pink, the schedulings. So this is our new office. We're now in a very modern building with stunning views, just there, above Cannon Street Station. But here, if you were using your phone, you could click on one of those blue triangles and it would take you straight to the list entry, or you could click on one of the pink areas and find out what the scheduling will tell you. So you can walk around the country effectively with your PEVSNA on your phone. So it's not known well enough, this, but in celebrating the list, I think it's something we need to push rather more. So I'd encourage you to do that. Search the list through the map and find out what's around you. I said also that the database is quite incredible and we're improving it constantly. I thought for fun I'd search on the word antiquarian, and it came up with 148 entries that mention antiquarian. So here's some of them, just the first page of 20, and so I went to the Church of St. Peter to find out what the story was. And it turns out that there's a tablet memorial to antiquary and historian of Thetford, T. Martin, FAS, died 1771. So you'd be amazed what you can find out in searching our online database on the free text search. It's an absolute treasure house, treasure trove. And photograph is something that's been added to the list by Bob Kindred through Enriching the List. So this is available on the same site for St. Peter as well. It shows the interior of the church where our dear T. Martin has a memorial panel. I like to stress too that the list is very much a living archive. It's a dynamic resource. It is not put to sleep. It doesn't all just date back to 1947 and has never been changed. Just in the last 4 years, we have amended more than 10% of the list. 43,000 listings, address changes, text changes, mapping changes. The curation is constant and ongoing as far as resources will allow. It's terribly important, and the lists are very dynamic and very much alive. This just shows you some of the amendments over 1 year by ceremonial county. The deeper the blue, in a sense, the more amendments occurred. So just for interest, to show you that we can report in all sorts of different ways. And again, to prove that the lists are very much alive, this shows you the increase across parts of the country. It's figures in our Heritage Counts publication, and is fairly recent. Basically, the trajectory is upward, I'm happy to report. And last but very much not least, I've mentioned the Enriching the List initiative, which is a new one, only just in existence since June 2016. This is very much in response to the public appetite for an interest in the list, and seeking to develop that. We set to work. And two of the colleagues who've very much been seminal in this, Martin and John, are in the room. It's now possible for anyone to contribute to the list. You just have to go online, get a heritage passport, and you're set. You can add photographs, you can add narrative. We're finding this is very important because it's enhancing our collective knowledge and our understanding of the listed fabric. It's very welcome. And the contributions to date, enormous, 59,000 plus, nearly 60,000. Loads of images which you'll be able to see. So where the list previously wasn't illustrated per se, there's now many that are. And we have 750 active contributors. We hope you might join that list. These are just some of the photographs added through Enriching the List by various members of the public. It's quite addictive once you set about it. You'll go around with your iPhone and your blue triangles, taking photographs and adding, and it's great fun, so to be encouraged. So to conclude and hopefully take some questions, there's lots to do. We need to keep up with the understanding. We need to continue to protect and celebrate 70 years on. We need the public support for heritage. That's obviously important, and we're doing everything we can to ensure that the lists stay relevant and respond to the demands. Do go away and enjoy Enriching the List. Just go online and find your way around. But also look at our online debate on the 70 years of the 1947 Act. There's a collection of some very interesting perspectives from different parts of the country and the professions and lay people on what they think has been achieved in the last 70 years. And we'd be very interested to hear from you. Thank you.